Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Monday, November 12th, 2018. I guess maybe a good way to start out today's program would be to, I might as well just fake having a frog in my throat immediately and see if that wards off the real thing from happening. I can hardly speak. Okay, now that out of the way, I'm very worried about this happening each day, and it bothers me that it takes me by surprise each day. Anyway, plenty to catch up on today. Trump went abroad and embarrassed us. That's kind of what's going to happen. And really, anytime you say the words Trump and abroad, you're probably going to... All right, okay. Well, you're probably going to end up with an embarrassment somewhere along the line. Okay. I couldn't resist and probably should have. Plenty to catch up on. Of course, like I said, Trump went abroad and embarrassed everybody and did absolutely the wrong thing in every possible instance. And the media helped. Again, what do you know? It looks like the media spent the weekend, I would say inaccurately. I would say inaccurately that the media seemed to have spent most of the weekend defending, in a way, or trying to come up with some sort of explanation for Trump skipping the memorial service at the American cemetery outside of Paris during the 100th anniversary of the armistice ending World War I. He didn't go to you all know the story by now, and you probably also watched all weekend as the press tried to come up with explanations. It was raining, and that was a bad explanation, and because it didn't really rain all that much. But I guess the excuse they were offering ultimately was, well, the cemetery is 55 miles outside of Paris. And the plan was for him to take the Marine One helicopter there, but the weather was lousy, and you know how these things go. So they started to come up with some excuse about the helicopter couldn't operate. I don't think, accurately speaking, that the claim was it doesn't fly in the rain. I think it was foggy. That's probably not great conditions for flying a helicopter in. I could grant you that much, but you just stop with the idea of, oh my gosh, the President of the United States just couldn't make it to this memorial service, again, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. Every leader who was in France for the big celebration made it to their national cemeteries, I suppose. I guess with the exception of Angela Merkel, who I'm guessing there's no, official German cemetery in France for World War I, but she did the respectful thing, I'm sure. Donald Trump couldn't be bothered. And of course, other members of the American delegation did make it to that service. They went by car. And we did learn that the president did bring a car with him when we saw news reports from the next day that a topless protester, there's several of them, I think, but only one was featured in the article, threw herself, I guess, in front of the motorcade. Others of them, I guess, were more prudent in avoiding the moving vehicles. But you know how protesters are these days, even the topless ones. And I don't know whether that bothered Trump or not. I mean, it may have been, he was probably less disturbed by the signs than, his ability. So she's not a 10. This is ridiculous. I'm outraged that this topless protester has thrown herself in front, and I don't even want to molest her in any way, shape, or form. So that was probably the most disturbing part of it. But he did have a car, and he could have driven to the cemetery as everybody else did. We can't really linger on this because it's dumb. What I really want to, if anything, I would linger on the fact that the press was falling over itself to try to come up with logistical explanations. If the President of the United States wants to make it to the memorial service for the end of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, he makes it there, period. The military airlifts him there. He parachutes in. They drive him there. It doesn't make a difference. So the obsession with trying to come up with an explanation I found distasteful and beneath them. But, what's beneath the press these days? So that's another issue we'll have to take up too. Lots of op-ed type opining on whether or not the press corps should return to the White House to cover the daily briefings or whether they've had enough. The answer is, of course, no. Of course they haven't had enough. They'll be back. And now the opinion's swinging the other way, reading op-eds about how it's absolutely essential that they show up to cover the nonsense and the lies. By the way, also over the weekend, we found out that the poor, what's a good word for it? The poor intern who was viciously attacked and, as you know, brutally murdered in front of the rest of the White House press corps by Jim Acosta is not an intern at all. She's a deputy press secretary. She's making $130,000. Not really somebody you have to feel terribly upset about getting in the line of fire. Why they pretended she was an intern, I don't know. But why she would do what she did, then pretend she was an intern, then try to victimize Acosta in all this, and then everybody who went to Paris was like, well, gee whiz, maybe the helicopter doesn't work in rain. You know what? Maybe they just lie to you about everything, and you should just forget trying to figure out. And I guess if you try to figure out the logistics of it, it makes you sound like you're technically competent in some way, like, people who learn military terminology and spew that back, and it's supposed to make them sound sophisticated and urbane somehow. The guy doesn't like going to stuff that he doesn't like to do. It's presidential, and he hates it, and it owns the libs not to go, so he didn't go. That's the story. So there, I've covered the weekend for you. Greg, anything else you want to discuss is fine, There's other stories around. Good morning.
I think what we need to do is cover the fake and the real video that's floating around from the weekend. The fake one that was really good was, of course, Acosta and this highly paid deputy press secretary wrestling over the microphone.
Yes, it's too bad she died in that, but it is sad.
Playing thumb wrestling, and Acosta pulled a knife on her to get her to... I don't know if you saw that one, but it's really very funny.
One of the late night shows did that one, and it was a good one.
Yeah. And then the other real video that's around is Angela Merkel trying to explain to a 101-year-old French woman that she's not Macron's wife. She's actually the Chancellor of Germany. And she's trying to explain it in French, which she is not fluent in.
Yeah.
She's in German, Russian, Czech. And she speaks passable English, better than me. And but it's very funny. The woman is so happy to understand what's going on here. So she didn't understand why Merkel and Macron were cuddling up together, but it was cold and it was raining.
Okay. All right. And, 101 years old, you wonder sometimes, you are aware that France and Germany are allied now. It has been for a very long time, a large part of your 101 years. But, you never know where they think they are sometimes. Yeah. And I guess she had was perfectly clear.
Which one got Alsace-Lorraine? I can't remember.
Yes. Well, it did go back and forth a couple of times over the hundreds of years. So I think it's French now, isn't it?
Well, it's
where they brew Kronenbourg beer.
They taught in the schools. That's how it goes.
I know that much.
And,
that's how I can
for a discussion of the Sudetenland. So these things happen, but yes. It was. I did not see what you saw. I didn't see the press apologizing for Trump. I saw the press blasting Trump.
I saw a lot of blasting.
Because it was Veterans Day, and the fact that he's never been to to visit the troops at a battlefield, and he went. I guess he went to one return ceremony and hated it and vowed never to go to another one because it was depressing or something like that.
He can't hump those flags. They're on coffins.
By the way, did you see that there's Fox News now has commercials about the new Trumpy bear?
I did see that, and
did you see that? It's wonderful. It's a little plush Trumpy bear with Trumpy hair, and you can unzip it in the back and pull out an American flag blanket. And people had to go to Snopes to fact check this and say, "Is this real? This looks like Saturday Night Live." No, it's real.
It's real. People brushing the hair, which is I don't know where they got the idea that he brushes that, but. I think the zipper where the flag pocketed is too high, and it really should be a little lower on the back.
And,
down the bottom, pull the flag out that way.
Yeah, but that's how he wears his tie,
Oh, yes.
From top to bottom, it's very, very long, much longer than you would think is necessary.
Yeah. Well, you pull the flag out, and it's a cozy blanket, and I don't think you're supposed to wrap. Well, you're not supposed to really do that with
No,
the
you're
flag.
supposed to wrap it around you and then rock in the chair with your thumb in your mouth holding the... I mean,
Yes.
one of the people in the commercial actually does that. Wraps the blanket and then cuddles the bear and then rocks in a rocking chair. And it's to protect you. The way that the commercial starts is that the storm is coming. I will protect you from the storm. They must have been talking about Tuesday's election because,
bear.
it really went fairly poorly for Trumpy Bear, as it turns out.
Yeah. I did see. I saw that commercial in passing in the last couple of minutes, and it's disturbing. But I don't know. I guess, look, people bought the fish that sings "Take Me to the River," so I suppose they'll buy this.
Yeah, but that at least is cute.
Could be the ironic gift of the season.
Yeah,
Possibly.
pet rock.
All right. Well,
Your
that's
chia Trump. Just water it and hair grows.
yeah.
I'm sure
I
that.
don't have that yet.
So another thing that we should clean up from last week is that now we have finally an actual police report.
A what report? Police report?
On Tucker Carlson and what
yes.
happened at his house.
Right, nothing. He's a liar.
Nothing, and he's a liar. That is correct.
Okay.
One last point on the Tucker Carlson protest. This is from Rebecca Kavanaugh. Has a lovely tweet about it.
All right.
You don't want to believe the protesters. Why not go to the police version of events? Because there is a police report. And I'm going to say it's probably a more reliable source than Mr. Carlson, and it completely contradicts him. So here goes.
Okay.
First, the police interacted with the protesters as they were leaving, and they didn't arrest anybody. They saw the person spray paint the anarchist symbol on the driveway. The protesters were walking away slowly, because they were walking with canes. No one tried to run. There were 4 legal observers at the protest. People going to somebody's house to break in don't usually take legal observers.
I do.
The police talked to the protesters about not having a problem with them exercising their First Amendment rights, but that spray painting the driveway was crossing the line, and that was the issue. If the police had received a frantic 911 call from Ms. Carlson saying she was terrified and locked herself in her pantry and people were trying to break in the house, there's no way the police would have let the protesters go. They would have made arrests. There would have been so many SWAT cars to that location. If she represented what was happening that way, police tend to overreact. They didn't hear. In the police report, there's no mention whatsoever of any damage to the front door of Mr. Carlson's residence, not a scratch. Consistent with the protesters saying what they did is they knocked on the door and left a placard.
Okay.
That's where they were trying to break the door down. And
They cracked it. They killed her.
There's no mention in the police report of anyone chanting anything about pipe bombs or chanting any sort of threats.
No.
What the police appeared to be focused on was the spraying of the anarchist symbol on the driveway. That was the extent of the property damage. There was the extent of the activity that could possibly be construed as unlawful. And even when it was reported that the incident was being looked at as a hate crime, it appears this was the focus of the investigation. Now, that could be prosecuted as a hate crime as a subject for another day, which is of concern now.
We all hate crime.
There's been such misreporting. I hope those people will take the time to reconsider and correct their misstatements. And let me add, I'm not one to point to the police as a credible source. I'm a public defender, but they are a more credible source than Tucker Carlson.
True.
Right? I'm also trying to beat the MAGA folks at their own game. Like, what? You don't believe law enforcement?
No, they don't. They
well, let's take Florida, for example.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Because Florida tries to do unlawful things but brings legal observers with them. At least the Florida Republican Party does. And, they try to have Brooks Brothers riots and get everybody all jacked up about it. And
yes.
Donald Trump this morning is tweeting fascist stuff. Why do I say fascist? Isn't that an overreaction? I don't think so. Okay. He says the Florida election should be called in favor of Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis in that large numbers of new ballots showed up out of nowhere. I think that was like Opelika, the mail facility, where tens of thousands of ballots that were mailed but never got there were found. And many ballots are missing or forged. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with election night. So, in other words, you should stop vote counting and you should cancel the election. I won, and to hell with democracy, and people's votes don't count. That's what he's saying.
The answer is whatever the telly said when I went to sleep.
The answer is whoever's ahead gets to decide. If you're behind, you have to keep counting, and if you're ahead, you have to stop. I mean, that's basically where he's at. Florida is a little tricky to figure out because Rick Scott not exactly the most reliable guy in the world, given that he's had some issues about paying fines for like lying about his business, for example.
Yes.
Has been running around saying fraud, 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 and nobody really knew what he was talking about. But I'm gathering from this Mark Elias tweet, the Democratic lawyer, breaking, no Floridian should have their rightful vote denied because of mail or post office delays.
Yes.
We're suing to protect those ballots. So I presume he's talking about the Opelika ballots that were found and other ballots that may have been late to be received because the post office's fault. And there are stories about that. There's stories that people are telling on Twitter about, getting a ballot and trying to send it in and then finding out that it just didn't get there, and then you're stuck and you can't do anything about it. And at the same time, although Georgia's is much more famous, there's stuff about having ballot workers all of a sudden be experts at handwriting to decide whether or not this handwriting sample matches that handwriting sample, and therefore is this a legal ballot or not?
Yeah.
Which is really a form of suppression. There's no possible look. A handwriting analysis is pseudoscience to begin with, and the idea that poll workers would be trained to understand the difference between I'm in a hurry and I just had a cup of coffee signature versus what they have on file, I don't know where, from like 35 years ago signature, is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So are the comments that Rick Scott is making about fraud based on the fact that there are mail held up votes, which is kind of weird because vote by mail usually favors Republicans anyway? Or is he talking about, I don't want to have votes where the signature doesn't match something that was deemed illegal by the courts in Georgia? So I'm trying to figure out where he's at with that. But there seems to be some basis for his accusations as opposed to what's going on in Arizona, where there is no basis for accusations.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, Republicans in Arizona are saying, leave us off this whole discussion. You in Washington may want to gin up stuff about, voter fraud, but that's not happening here. This is a normal Arizona election. Everybody's behaving, and Martha McSally is losing fair and square. That's the article in the Washington Post today.
Yeah.
From people, John Weaver, who used to work with John McCain.
It sounds like they've been urging McSally to start alleging fraud, and I don't know whether she ever will or not. And it may have more to do, or it may have less to do with her integrity than the issue of there being another Senate seat opening for a special election there soon, and why
in her behaving, you mean? Because
yes.
John Kyle has been appointed, and should she lose, which looks incredibly likely, in fact, she's probably already lost, then she gets to be appointed to Kyle's current seat.
Yes.
And so she's behaving herself. Well, that's fine, but, if she's behaving herself for whatever reasons, that's fine. That's better than what Scott is doing, and that's better than what Trump is doing.
That is true. And
so we can go with that.
Yeah. The other thing I understand is that a lot of times military ballots come in at this stage of the game, and I saw somebody...
Well, they're mailed, right? So he's trying to not have the military count.
Yes.
How does that go? That goes over with this whole weekend of trying to disrespect troops.
Right. So tell me about how taking a knee is so awful again.
So I'm fairly confident that Kristen Sinema has already won the Arizona senatorial race. I am totally unsure as to what's supposed to happen in Florida because I don't know how many votes are outstanding, whether it's a ballot problem, whether it's a count the votes problem, whether it's a recognize that those are rightful votes problem. But we'll get that sorted out in Florida over the next couple of weeks, I presume. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is, when you step back and look at the big picture, it turns out that the Democrats did really well on Thursday. And that is despite the bad start for Democrats because Florida was called relatively early, and then, the uncalled never really totally undoes the feelings you get with the call.
Television
Interestingly, though, our friend Stephen Andrew from Daily Kos says, one of the only good things to come out of that is that Republicans felt good enough about Tuesday night early. They didn't push the whole narrative of the Democratic win in the House was vote fraud. They never got started on that. And now it's too late.
Right.
They
Now
probably wish they would have.
Yeah, they should have just said that right away. I don't know why they didn't go. They should have stuck with their plan. I guess they got
they
excited.
thought they were winning, so then they decided not to, and then it turns out it's too late. So, again, some of these narratives get frozen in time, but the fact of the matter is that when you step back and look and see what happened last Tuesday, I wrote about this in the Pundit Roundup today, so I'll read from it because it's all there in front of me.
That's allowed.
As the election count continues, Kristen Sinema, the next senator from Arizona, leads at this writing by actually 32,000. In the House, the Democrats will flip between 36 and 39 seats, minimum of 36, max 39. At state level, Democrats won 7 governors, 6 trifectas. That means the governor of the House and the Senate in a particular place, like Connecticut, for example, where the House was Democratic, but the Senate was tied. Now it's Democratic. Governor is Democratic. So even without Florida, Election Day 2018 was a full-blown disaster for Republicans and a repudiation at national level. It's true, the redder areas went crimson, but that's not the majority of the country. The Democrats will win the popular vote right now by 7%, which, by the way, matches the generic ballot, but may go as high as 9% after California is finally counted.
Oh, in that case, polls suck.
The House popular vote, as of now, represented a 4.4 swing in our favor from 2016. And exit polls, flawed though they are, suggest that the Democrats won independents by 12 points, and in 2016, the Democrats lost those voters by 4, so that's a 16-point swing. That is pretty impressive, and that's where the repudiation of Trumpism comes. Interestingly, the Democrats and the Republicans were way more partisan this election. Only 4% of each party voted for the other party compared to 8% in 2016, and independents, therefore, are how we won. And that also suggests, the exit polls do, that they were winning on the issues. Yes. As Dave Wasserman pointed out, the story developing as the full picture of Tuesday's results comes into focus is significantly more favorable to Democrats than the narrative that emerged on election night.
Well, we continue to have this back and forth fight about whether the election was really about issues or really about Trump or really about some mix of both. And it's switched about 19 times now. I'm not sure.
Well, it was about both. And both times, voters on the whole came down on the Democrat side. Now, you can look at that and say, oh, my goodness, if 96% of the Republicans voted for the Republicans, where are the persuadable Republicans and the never-Trumpers and the people, well, that's not really how you can measure that. That Republican amount, hides the fact that people switch all the time. They switch from Republican to Independent and back and forth. Brookings notes that the 2018 exit polls indicate that a considerable share of Democratic gains came from shifts in white voting patterns, even as Democrats retained strong support from racial minorities. In other words, you can win back white voters without throwing people of color under the bus. That's an important factor.
Hey,
moreover, Brookings says, in key Midwest statewide elections, Democrats lost fewer white working-class male votes while retaining support among white female college graduate votes.
Okay.
So we got the people we said we were going to get, and we lost fewer of the white working class votes. Now, one of the key things about that is often lost in those kind of statistics, and I don't have it in front of me, but I saw this flash by, looking at the evangelical vote. I mean, if you're looking at white women evangelicals, for example, 75 or something like that, 73, 75% voted for Republicans. But non-evangelical voters were like 26%.
Okay.
So when you're talking about the white working class, when you're talking about white women, when you're talking about any of those voters, you have to check and see, well, how much of that is evangelical? Because the evangelicals are the Trump base that generally doesn't move from him. It's everybody else that moves.
Yeah. Well, it's the people it's for whom their Christian morals are super important.
It's the people for whom they feel like they don't have any choice and they're boxed in a corner. I'm not trying to defend them, but I'm just saying that those people aren't going to change their votes.
No,
and you are wasting your time trying to argue with them. Those people need to be outvoted.
Yes.
But you can do that by talking to everybody else.
Right. That's the list to buy, by the way. You want to develop your voter files, buy the Trumpy Bear order form list, and that's it. The reverse of it, the reverse image is what the persuadables.
You can put it up on the fireplace mantle next to your George W. Bush action figure, which they also sold at the time. You remember that? He was in the flight suit. that landed on the aircraft carrier, mission accomplished.
Kung Fu grip, all that stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I'll bet that Trumpy bear is such a fire hazard, I would guess.
Right. Exit polls say voters did not support Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court. What? Almost half of voters opposed him. 40% supported. Half of men supported him. Fewer than 40% of women. On Roe v. Wade, 2/3 of 2018 voters, 2/3, said they would like to keep the landmark Supreme Court decision in place. Only a quarter want it overturned. More than 80% said that sexual harassment is a very or somewhat serious problem in the country today. Almost half said it's very serious. So that's another example of not winning on the issues. And as we come up to our break, I'll note another Dave Wasserman little nugget here. If every uncalled race breaks, as he expects, House Democrats' class of 61 freshmen would include 35 women and 19 white men.
Okay.
By contrast, Republicans' class of 31 would include 29 white men and just one woman.
Well, they got to do something about that woman.
Yeah, well, it's the year of the woman, and that's the woman.
All right. That's right. They can point to that. Exactly right. It didn't say year of
the year
women.
Of the woman. It's this one right over here. This
is the one where the rest of them don't count. Yeah, I also saw somebody had some stats about the overall percentage of white men as a part of the Democratic caucus, A, decreasing, and B, coming in at some number in, I don't know, 40s perhaps, 30s.
Yeah, less than 50.
The percentage of white men in the Republican conference increasing, going to 90%. So, exact opposite trend. That won't bother the evangelicals and the hardcores and the people who buy the Trumpy bear, of course. They love it. Their base loves that. It's just that their base just doesn't represent a great deal of the country, and it might not work come election time. I don't know. They might, if we count those vote things. Anyway, we'll be back in 2 minutes to decide whether or not the democracy survives. See what happens.
We'll see.
Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Greg Gorkin is still with us. Greg was asking during the break whether Armando might be available to discuss a little bit of what went on in Florida. And I guess the thing to do is for you to say that he's not available, and then that would trigger him to call in and say you were wrong.
And that he doesn't know anything about Florida, so why would we want him?
I didn't think we'd have to go that far, but why not throw it in there? Let's put all the cards on the table.
But, Florida obviously is quite important. It's a moving target, and there's a lot of subtlety to that. And, so we'd appreciate his input. At the moment, all I can say from outside Florida, being a non-expert on Florida, is that it's a mess.
Okay. I'll accept that.
Dave Wasserman also had some other interesting nuggets of factoids here to throw out.
Okay.
He said, on Tuesday, with a few exceptions, America didn't hold elections between candidates so much as a census on how many D's and R's live in given areas. To illustrate what I mean, he says, Republicans are on track to hold 96%, 191 out of 199, 96% of the districts Trump carried by 7% or more, and Democrats are on track to hold 96% of the others.
Okay.
So you had very heavy Trump areas, and then you had the rest of the country. And that's what happened basically in North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri in terms of the Senate race. The red areas voted for Trump, and everybody else voted for Democrats. And he gives a couple of other examples of that. And this is something that will be familiar to your listeners, because we've talked about the fact that waves happen when you wind up winning more than your share of the toss-ups, but by small amounts.
Yes.
It's not that you clobber everybody in every district. That's exactly what happened on Tuesday night. Wasserman points out the difference makers that got the Democrats from between plus 30 to nearly plus 40 House seats, which is where they'll wind up, were the districts that voted for Trump between 0 to 5%. In other words, the heavily Trump districts voted for Republicans. Everybody else voted for Democrats. And what Democrats wound up winning that made it such a big House swing where Trump won between 0 and 5%, the very close races. And a great example, close to home to you, not exactly where you live, but close to you, is Virginia 2.
Okay.
Where Scott Taylor lost. Okay, and that's the Newport News area, Poquoson, places that are, or at least in the past, were Republican leaning, and military base, included, and yet wound up swinging to the Democrat.
Well,
and that wasn't an area that went 90% for Trump. It's not like a Steve King's district.
Yeah.
But or Duncan Hunter's district. But at the same time, it was what turned out to be a swing area. It turned out to be a closely fought race where the Democrat won by a very small amount at the very, very end. And what made that happen is that people motivated to go out and vote and bring their families out to vote, and they made the difference.
I guess so. And even in these heavily military areas, I don't think it would have been in time to have an impact on the election, but I guess at some point it might dawn on you, hey, this guy doesn't care about the military at all. Why do we say he does?
Well,
I'm not sure.
He doesn't, but, my guess in that district and other districts like it is college-educated women made the difference.
Well, keep educating them, I guess. I guess that's one of the issues they have with making it affordable. If we make it affordable, there'll be more college-educated women. That's terrible for us.
Meanwhile, there's still a bunch of races that's still yet to be decided. And again, one of the really close ones is the Secretary of State race in Arizona.
Oh.
I said Kristen Sinema is likely to win. Yes. She's like 32,000 votes ahead. But the Secretary of State, again, with 200,000 votes left to count, many of them from Democratic areas, Steve Gaynor, the Secretary of State candidate for the Republicans, is leading landslide Katie Hobbs by 424 votes.
Oh, okay.
And landslide Katie's likely to flip that. I mean, just yesterday, she was leading by 150 votes.
Oh, well, then it's flipping a couple times.
Yeah, but with Democratic votes still left to count in the areas that are yet to be counted, Maricopa County this year is turning out to be an ever so slightly Democratic area. And Pima, in particular, is a more heavily Democratic area with a lot of votes there left to count. Katie might win.
Okay.
I'll take it. That's one of those areas where we, need to win votes not just at the governor level, which we've done this cycle, not just at the Senate level, which we did in Nevada and in Arizona, which we're talking about, not just at the state level in terms of their legislatures, but we have to win those very important Attorney General and Secretary of State elections.
Yes, right.
And Georgia is, and unfortunately maybe Florida, are going to be terrific examples of why the Secretary of State is such an important position, and we got to pay more attention to that.
Yes. And we've known this for a while. It's just
we remember it every 4 years,
Yeah.
But we got to keep the focus is what I'm saying.
Right. So we
appreciate the wins.
Famous examples in the past, and now I guess fading in memory. Ohio 2004, Florida 2000 nothing. I guess I started with that's 2000 nothing. Yeah, there we go. 2000 period. End of sentence. But and for a while there, we did briefly say, oh yes, these are important results in important races. Yeah, well, we need another round of that. People are still somewhat awake to that, but we could do better there.
Right, we could. All right, so two quick things to do before I go. One is the Nancy Pelosi insurgency,
All right.
which hasn't developed, but people like to talk about because, people like to talk.
Sure. If they aren't in disarray, there's no point in talking about Dems.
Right, exactly. And a lot of the pundits, I was making fun of the pundits this morning, they like to say things like, well, I don't know anything, so therefore I'm a great example of a low information voter, and therefore I'm qualified to talk about it.
That might work. It's so
And,
crazy. All right. Yes.
It's so crazy it might work. And so, I would say, well, what about the election? And they would say, what? There was an election? That doesn't change my opinion.
That. Yeah.
Why would that change my opinion? So Nancy
about?
Pelosi is now in position to become the next Speaker of the House.
Yes.
And there are people who are elected specifically on the platform of I'm not voting for Nancy Pelosi, but she still has the votes.
Yes.
And there are people who are unhappy about somebody who is of that generation and feel like younger leadership is needed without specifying why. And there's a couple of things to that. My generic answer to that is you need somebody who knows what they're doing. And by the way, she's second in line for the presidency, so whoever gets that slot ought to be qualified.
Sure.
I know it's old-fashioned. We talked about that in 2016, and people think, well, that didn't count, so you don't have to talk about it anymore.
Right.
I still think it matters. But Josh Hooter, who is over at GAI Georgetown.
Oh, all right.
Poli-sci, PhD, and Congress nerd, he self-described, says, look, the Pelosi insurgency suffers major organizational and clarity problems. I haven't read anything forcing a reevaluation of that, including a piece he links to from Politico.
Does that mean
he says hardball procedural tactics need organization.
Yes.
And, of course, we're nothing but into procedure here at Kagro in the Morning because David is an expert on that. They require forming numbers toward a coherent end. Every effective insurgency in congressional history has had a cadre of entrepreneurs focusing latent angst into an actionable goal. This insurgency has none of that. Till there are signs it forms a clear goal, you have to presume Pelosi's going to win.
It's a pretty good assumption, yes. And
she got the votes.
Yeah, well, I guess that's what makes it a good assumption.
Right, and you need a candidate.
Yes, that's the other problem.
So lots of signs the press is still adjusting to the new majority. Democrats have a left wing, but it's been less prone to caucus-defeating schisms. The Democratic caucus is different than the Republican conference. A left-wing House Freedom Conference has not formed yet.
True.
Doesn't mean procedural hardball won't occur or that Democrats won't leverage the votes to deny Pelosi a majority, but the signs it's possible or probable simply aren't there. So you can't beat somebody with nobody.
That's one of the problems, yes.
I mean, who's the candidate? Who's the candidate who's ready to step in and be president? And who's the candidate who can organize the Democrats and count votes? And you have to think of this as a caucus leader, not leader of the free world alternative to Trump. That's not the job of the speaker, certainly not this early anyway. And one of the jokes that the media made, one of the hash piles they made of trying to analyze 2016 through 2018 was trying to thrust Paul Ryan into a position that he didn't want, he wasn't qualified for, and he wasn't going to do. He's not opposition to Trump. He's not a spokesperson for the Republican Party. He's none of those things. And actually what happened is he faded into the woodwork, and you never heard from him. Yeah,
largely true. He wasn't suited to the job, and I guess that's what happens.
Right. Now, when Pelosi becomes Speaker, and she probably will, she also is not all of a sudden going to become the voice of the Democratic Party. The press will try to make her that because they want to go to somebody, but that's not what the job is. And, it's going to look like a fail because they won't cover it properly. And that's because they don't really understand what the job is.
Very few people do, as it turns out, but we can try and help.
That's why we have this show, right?
Yeah. And, we'll fail to understand it entirely at some point on some aspect, I'm sure, and be surprised.
We'll fail better.
Happens. Yes, there you go. That's our promise to you. We'll fail better. This is good.
All the news that fits, we print, and we fail better.
I think that can work as a tagline.
could.
We've not yet had a tagline yet, and that's probably a good one.
Right. Now, I want to briefly, in the moments I have before I got to scoot off to work and do doctor stuff, is talk about doctors.
Okay. Well,
Okay. There was
they ought to let you
a very
spend
interesting
time on
thing that happened. The NRA tweeted, somebody should tell self-important anti-gun doctors to stay in their lane. Half of the articles in Annals of Internal Medicine are pushing for gun control. Most upsetting, however, the medical community seems to have consulted no one but themselves. And all sorts of people got in on this, from Ann Coulter to politicians. And, it was offensive. And the docs took offense to it and created a Twitter hashtag called This Is My Lane, which you can go look at. And This Is Our Lane, which is incredible. For example, showing a picture of a chair just sitting in a quiet room. Hey, NRA, want to see my lane? Here's the chair I sit when I tell parents the kids are dead. How dare you tell me I can't research evidence-based solutions? Basically, that's how it went.
Yeah.
What do you think? Who do you think removes bullets from spines and repairs or tries to livers blasted by an AR-15? The Tooth Fairy? This literally is medicine's lane.
Yes.
And hundreds of comments like that. In fact, 15,000 doctors signed a letter to that effect, which you can read in USA Today. Doctors say guns are our lane, help us reduce deaths and move over. Megan Rennie, who's a researcher, and Heather Scher, who's a radiologist who was involved with Parkland, Derek Cass, wrote an op-ed about that. There's interviews of them today in the Washington Post. Being silenced is not acceptable. Doctors express outrage after NRA tells them to stay in their lane. Now, I have to point out, this comes after an election where at least 15 of their NRA-supported people in Congress lost. They're losing influence. They're losing money.
Yes.
And they're losing the social media war.
Yes, and they've been taken over by Russia.
That too. And more of that to come. And by the way, now that the election is over and, Mueller's a lot more active, yeah, we got the whole problem with a new acting attorney general stuck in there exactly to stop the Mueller probe, which can't be stopped. But there's more to come on that, and maybe worrying about Don Jr. getting indicted is what's driving Trump to not be in the rain. He was busy on the phone,
maybe
trying to make up stuff about saving his family.
I wonder who he was talking to, or whether I don't know. I can't decide whether he was furiously meeting behind the scenes with people he shouldn't be talking to anyway, or napping, or just watching TV. I'm not certain what he was doing. None of which is productive, of course.
Anyway, so that's my show for today. But, it's positive results for Arizona, positive results for the House. Florida is still to come. But it was a pretty resounding win for the Democrats. And I think that's going to take a little time to sink in, but I think it'll become a lot more evident as you start to see, oh, my goodness, Democrats actually being interviewed in the press instead of just Republicans. As you see calls for things like Trump's tax returns have to be taken seriously, because now people with power to implement that sort of call are now going to take over on January 3rd. And it's going to be an interesting road.
Yes.
So we'll be back on Wednesday, and we'll talk a little bit more about fallout and what's happening.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, I just saw a tweet from Preet Bahara.
Okay.
Who says, you know what? Dr. Twitter is very good Twitter.
He's enjoying it. Okay. Yeah, it was pretty good, I will say that. And they did a great job defending the whole thing. I don't know why you would need to defend anything. And by the way, I thought the whole thing was ridiculous from the outset, but from a slightly different angle. A medical journal is your lane. That's what they were doing, writing in a medical journal. Stay in your lane.
Yeah, exactly.
What?
So, Ann Coulter told doctors that just because you pull all sorts of things out of orifices, like gummies and plants and stuff like that, doesn't make you experts in horticulture or, candy manufacture and all sorts of stuff. And, of course, the colorectal surgeons pointed out that they actually work all the time with assholes. They know one when they see one. And this is our lane.
I guess so. Well, you stepped in it there, Ann, but that's her job, I guess.
I guess. All righty. Take care. I'll talk to you on Wednesday.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Greg. And yes, door once again open for you. Armando, I have a nice comment here. I don't know whether it was meant to reach us or not, but in response to the regular morning tweets that we get both from Bill in Portland and the mighty OCD, and I didn't read them this morning, and they were good ones too. For instance, Bill says, Daily Kos Radio is live right now. It's a little late to give you that message, obviously. But the disclaimer was here, unless there's a raindrop in the vicinity, in which case I, Greg, and the rest of the crew here will just bail and watch TV. And it sounds like a pretty good suggestion. Should have taken him up on that one. I'm sure I could make it look like it's raining. The mighty OCD commenting that the story, we were live again today. Let's see, the inimitable Dr. Dworkin will tell us why to be hopeful. David, that's me, hi, will interrupt him. Really? Rarely. And if we're lucky, Armando will call in and explain why they're both wrong. Now, this is what prompted the comments. And let's see, we have, and I never know how to deal with this thing, when we have your Twitter handle versus the name that you put in, and there are two different things here. John Monch, M-O-N-C-H, is how he tweets. That's the important one, I think, really. If you were to decide, hey, I want to follow along with somebody who has something like this to say, he's tagged his account with Captain Renault, if you're an English speaker. But John has this to say, my wife and I were talking about Armando the other night. What do you think about that? Sounds kind of interesting. Having been old-time cogs, that would be users of the Daily Kos website, one of many little nicknames that we give ourselves there. With all of his, they're talking about Armando, with all of his, let's go with quirks. I think that's very kind of you. He engages, and we both found him infuriating and liked the hell out of him. I didn't know you could get hell out of somebody with like, but I guess it can work. I'm glad he's around. Mighty OCD, of course, says me too. I've been enjoying his quirks since the early days of Kos, Daily Kos for sure. Very interesting. And by the way, and here's an interesting update on things separately. I'm told by John here, my wife and I met on Daily Kos. How do you like that? After a few years of long distance, we got married 7 years ago and are living happily ever after. That's fantastic. I like the story about that. Thanks for sharing that. Even Mighty OCD likes it, and he's a notoriously cranky dude. That's cool, man. And so we'll agree with that. All the more reason for Armando to be tempted to join us on the air, but who knows what the schedule is like today. We'll see what we can come up with this week. I'm sure we'll be talking Florida really all week. I mean, there's no avoiding it. There is avoiding it. They could have so many stories, we could just flat forget to get to all of them. Let's see. Other internet comments here that we need to get around to. Let's see. From this morning, since the show has started, we have Michael Musson commenting, the incompetence of Trump's staff. Getting him to that cemetery is as easy as telling him it's a visit to one of his golf courses. That's true. They could have offered that one up. Another story from the weekend. Let's see. More about, what was I talking about again? Oh, yes, Jim Acosta. Right. One of the weirder developments over the weekend, Kellyanne Conway involving herself in this thing. The dispute over whether or not the tape released or retweeted, really, by the White House was doctored or not. And I guess splitting hairs about what the word even means. I guess the what do you call him? Well, the Alex, what's that guy's name again? Good. I'm kind of glad I can't remember. The Prison Planet wacko. Anyway, Jones? I don't know. What's it? I can't forget. Now I'm totally blanking on that guy's name. Good. What a great thing to have happen. Anyway, that conspiracy theory nut and his crew sent out a video of the event in which they apparently we talked about this last week. They slowed down the approach of the not intern, but in fact deputy White House press secretary, so that it looked less threatening to Acosta, and then they sped up Acosta's hand motion so that it looked like the incidental contact would, in real time, real speed, the incidental looking contact between his left hand and her arm, which has reached across his body to try and take the microphone out of his hand, which is problematic to begin with. They sped it up to make it look like he did some sort of powerful karate chop to her arm. And so the thin reed they're clinging to over there is that, well, that's not doctored. It simply has had the speed changed, which of course is doctoring, but no. It's not like we put something in there that wasn't actually on the film. We just changed the way you're viewing it, like they do for football games, in instant replay review. And everybody knows, of course, instant replay review is all about speeding up the film so that you can see what happens more clearly. That's what they do every single time, /never. So it was sort of a weird subplot to the story, I guess. And who knows why they might have gone with that one. They were just pulling something out of their hat, I guess. Let's see. Rebecca Romans pointing out for us a raw story report. Speaking of the evangelical crowd, evangelical pastor has explained how he hopes Trump's foreign policy will kickstart the end times. The Trumpocalypse is coming, Rebecca points out. Yeah, that's true. We've known about dominionists for quite some time. That's usually their Israel policy. We promote a foreign policy with Israel that will promote the apocalyptic war in the Middle East that's supposed to precede the end times. So par for the course there for the evangelical pastors. They're still up to their old tricks, and that, I guess, explains at least part of their persistence in supporting Trump, despite the fact that he shares almost no values with them whatsoever, unless it is, of course, the prompting of a worldwide conflagration that engulfs us all. Speaking of worldwide conflagrations that engulf us all, and not World War I, but perhaps World War III, or at least the nearest approach to World War III that we have in the offing at the moment. New York Times is reporting that, you'll never guess this one, North Korea was just kidding about all of the great progress that they wanted to make towards demilitarizing, denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, and for whatever reason, Donald Trump bought it. And I guess the beautiful, lovely letters, he fell in love. We fell in love. And while we were in love, I missed North Korea building even more nuclear missile bases, apparently. New York Times, which is failing horribly and bleeding badly from a facelift, says that in North Korea, missile bases suggest a great deception. They're great at deception there in North Korea. There is a satellite photo with some dotted lines and some signs about what they are supposed to be. And because I am a mere peasant, I can only accept as true that this blob of mountains, which is identified as Sakhanmol Ballistic Missile Operating Base, is in fact that or some other ballistic missile operating base. And you know what happens when they operate ballistic missiles. Nearby is an unidentified military facility. And again, I'll take their word for it that it is both a military facility and that it is unidentified. Because what else am I going to do? It's a very official-looking photo. It has mountains in it that feel Korean to me when I look at them. I mean, I don't know anything about this. But the experts who frequently get us into wars tell me, oh yeah, these are North Korean mountains, and sure, they look like regular mountains, but they're in fact very evil-sounding ballistic missile operating bases with horrible, horrible names like Sakhanmol, which in Korean means something that we're not told, but surely something sinister. It starts, after all, with an S. This is, I don't know what to tell you. The caption says, a satellite image of a secret North Korean ballistic missile base, which appears to not be secret anymore. The North has offered to dismantle a different major missile launching site, while continuing to make improvements at more than a dozen others. That would be the great deception here. We'll send Donald Trump a love letter and tell him we're dismantling a missile site, and in the meantime, build 10 more. That's, well, the truth is we were dismantling that one, so we weren't lying to you. The story, we'll take a dive in to the first couple minutes of it anyway. I can't spend the whole day on it, but you'll get the gist of it. North Korea is moving ahead with its ballistic missile program at 16 hidden bases that have been identified in new commercial satellite images. Commercial satellite images, not even secret military ones. This is a network long known to American intelligence agencies but left undiscussed, as President Trump claims to have neutralized the North's nuclear threat. I don't know how we should take this. I guess it means that our intelligence community is saying, well, look, we know what's going on and we're on top of things. The fact that the president is an ignorant moron is in some ways neither here nor there. They're building stuff. He thinks they're not, or it's in his interest to say they're not. And I guess at some point, you can't even cheer about this because of course it means that dangerous things are happening in North Korea. And while that might mean that Donald Trump is wrong, we also know that sitting in the background there somewhere is John Bolton and his crew, who will say, the failing New York Times may have this one right, and we might have to go to war against North Korea. And, well, will that prove Trump wrong? Sure. But then he'll just say, to his base, well, I thought we were in love, but it turns out he's been cheating on me. So you know what to do about this, So that will work, I think, with his crowd. I don't think it's going to lose him any standing with them. So to the extent that we're, saying at least people will see the truth about Donald Trump, they won't. And will be in danger of having a confrontation with a newly nuclearized power. So there we have it. Satellite images suggest that the North has been engaging in a great deception, and it's been just fantastic so far for us. We've really enjoyed it, and we'll keep one eye on it, and that's all we can afford, really, because there's so much going on. We have to keep another eye elsewhere. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just taking that brief 1-minute break to try and collect ourselves here. There's so many different directions that we can go. Well, I don't even know what to tell you. Let's see. I should grab this tweet here just so I can bring you later the news about the translation that I mentioned to you about Agent Trump. I saw at least Michael McFaul confirming that the translation that he says I didn't know what Google's translation was telling us about these tweets, but I would translate it about this way. And they both came to the conclusion that they were talking about him as Agent Trump. Whether they were doing that tongue-in-cheek or not, I don't know. But let's make sure we have that in the offering. Another direction we could go in, a major article out in, again, the failing New York Times. And, here again, we wonder about whether or not we should be paying for this stuff. Let's pair it up with this one first. In the NBC News pointing out, in addition to, we'll make a theme of this, in addition to skipping out on the memorial service at the American Cemetery during the Veterans Day weekend, we learn from NBC News that veterans, the living ones, haven't received their GI Bill benefits for months. Did you know this? Due to ongoing IT issues at the VA. Of course, the VA has been completely fixed by his panel of 3 pals at Mar-a-Lago, right? You remember that story, that his Mar-a-Lago friends have secretly asked to be able to take over the VA and to direct it from Florida, which, might not even make a certain amount, might actually make a certain amount of sense given the number of veterans living in Florida and in the Southeast generally. But, they, of course, like we found out about the purported acting attorney general, they've not been approved for the position by the United States Senate. They simply have Trump's ear, and Trump can force the Senate-approved officials over at the VA to listen to them on pain of being fired if they don't, I guess. Anyway, they're getting great results. Veterans haven't received GI Bill benefits for months due to ongoing IT issues at the VA. This is, to be kind, a train wreck, said Representative Phil Rowe, a Republican of Tennessee, probably one of the few Republicans who'll be back, chairman, currently anyway, of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. But we're about to relieve him of that responsibility. At which point, of course, Republicans will realize this is a huge problem and begin to blame Democrats for it. Let's see. Phil McCausland reporting for NBC News with this little anecdote here. Shelley Roundtree departed the U.S. Army in 2013 after seeing friends and fellow soldiers die in combat during his tour in Afghanistan. He was committed to transitioning to civilian life, and one of his first steps was to enroll in college with tuition and housing benefits he'd earned under the GI Bill. Good for you. But bad news is you're not going to get that money. Roundtree, 29, began studying marketing at Berkeley College in Midtown Manhattan. He dreams of working in the fashion industry, and he's close to graduating, but now there's a serious obstacle. The Department of Veterans Affairs is suffering from a series of information technology glitches that has caused GI Bill benefit payments covering education and housing to be delayed, or in the case of Roundtree, never to be delivered, like their absentee ballots. I'm about to lose everything that I own and become homeless. Big problem among vets, by the way, in case you didn't know, or in case you were trying to deny it, like, was that Bill O'Reilly used to do, right? I'm about to lose everything that I own and become homeless, Roundtree said. I don't want to be that veteran on the street begging for change because I haven't received what I was promised. That's uncomfortable. Without the GI Bill's housing stipend, Roundtree was kicked out of his apartment and is now living on his sister's couch, miles from school, where he feels like a burden on his family. The new living situation required him to move all his belongings into a storage container, which he can no longer afford. Now all of his possessions are in danger of being auctioned off by the storage facility and having the auction taped for a reality television show, of course. That's what we do these days. Roundtree said that because of his extremely strained finances, he is forced to choose between spending money on public transportation to get to his marketing classes or buying food. Not both. At the end of the day, the veteran said he often makes himself go to sleep hungry. It's just confusing, said Roundtree. Who is there for us? Who is representing us? Who is helping us? Who is doing what they need to do to better the situation for veterans? There are many veterans like Roundtree across the country who are still waiting for the VA to catch up with the backlog created after President Donald Trump signed the Forever GI Bill in 2017. The landmark piece of legislation greatly expanded benefits for veterans and their families, but it did not upgrade the VA's technical capabilities to account for those changes. While it is unclear how many GI Bill recipients were impacted by the delays as of November 8th, more than 82,000 are still waiting for their housing payments, with only weeks remaining in the school semester, according to the VA. Hundreds of thousands are believed to have been affected. The cause of the difficulty lies within VA's Office of Information Technology, which was tasked with implementing a change to how the housing allowance was calculated. The agency said the Forever GI Bill required that housing would be based on the zip code of where a veteran went to school, not where he or she lived. Issues that arose when the VA attempted to stress test their antiquated system, and a contract dispute over the new changes meant VA waited until July 16th to tell schools to begin enrolling students, according to multiple veteran advocacy groups. Many colleges and universities waited, however, because VA told them that they would need to re-enter their students' veterans certifying information either way. That's when the floodgates opened, said Patrick Murray, the deputy director of the Veteran of Foreign Wars. With all the delays trying to get the upgrades in the zip code processing, they suddenly got all their enrollments, which usually come in during the spring, across the summer. Instead, they all came in a few weeks before the fall semester, and they couldn't keep up. Wah, wah. You know, I mean, these guys have to be ready for these changes. You can't simply say, let's do everything differently, but not pay for it. And, of course, it probably didn't help to have any people meddling from Mar-a-Lago on here. Does this get a mention at all? And I guess they either felt some trepidation about connecting it to them or could not connect it to them. I can't tell you which one was which, and they don't discuss who the contractors were on making the IT work here. But I imagine we'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. And we'll see whether they have reason to connect it to the interference of Trump's Mar-a-Lago buddies or not. In addition to this story, as I mentioned, the failing and bleeding badly from a facelift New York Times had a major story over the weekend. You likely caught at least a bit of it if you were paying any attention at all on Twitter, and I don't know why you should, but if you were, you would have seen the story headlined, "Deployed Inside the United States. The Military Waits for the Migrant Caravan." First mention of the migrant caravan in the news media, well, probably since Election Day. Or I should say the day before Election Day. So what's going on? What's the big deal? You know that they were dispatched. You know that it's looking more and more like a stupid stunt. The stupid part of it is increasing. With little electricity, no combat pay, because there's no combat, and holidays away from home. The 5,600 American troops in the Southwest on the border are on a mission ordered by a politically determined commander-in-chief, that's Trump, and a Pentagon unable to convince him of its perils. How do you like that? It's illustrated with a nice big picture of soldiers relaxing in their tent at Base Camp Donna in Texas. It's a tough-sounding name, Base Camp Donna. Thousands of troops have been deployed on the border with Mexico. I thought it would have been, Camp Blood and Guts, Kill the Immigrants, or something like that. But no, Camp Donna. So, all right. Here is the story reported by Thomas Gibbons Neff and Helene Cooper. Datelined Base Camp Donna, because where the hell is Base Camp Donna? They don't even know. I mean, you could say it's in such and such a county, but it's out there in the wastelands, I guess. Sergeant First Class Daniel Mychek, I'm guessing, M-I-C-E-K, a platoon sergeant with the 89th Military Police Brigade, tore open the brown packaging of his MRE on Thursday. You all remember the MREs. That's the meals ready to eat. That's the field rations that when you're out on deployment that you got to eat. It was a chicken and noodle dish. That sounds kind of nice, actually. And it says one of the more sought-after rations because it came with Skittles. Oh, you want one of these chicken and noodle dishes? You like those, huh? No, it's the Skittles that it comes with. Now, of course, in certain parts of the American South, if you're black and you walk around with the Skittles, you might get shot. But they're in the military. They all anticipate getting shot, I guess. But from the cot outside his platoon's tent at the Army's latest forward operating base, Sergeant Mychek could almost see the bright orange and white roof of Whataburger, the fast food utopia 8 miles away, but off limits under current Army rules. And you can't have people just walking out, I guess, and going to Whataburger if they're supposed to be there anticipating the very, very super dangerous killer bees / immigrant caravan that might take months to get there, but okay. But there he is, stuck eating MREs within sight of a favorite fast food place of his, but he has to sit there in case some, bedraggled group of migrants running away, fleeing violence in their own countries shows up. I need to be able to be here to confront them with more violence. I can't, be off at Whataburger. I mean, that would be kind of an embarrassment, I guess, I'd be okay with it, right? They're all eating at Whataburger and the caravan passed right by and they didn't notice. Anyway, the desert tan flatbed trucks at the base are for hauling concertina wire, not food runs, you silly veteran type military members. Grr, I shake my fist at you. Such is life on the latest front where American soldiers are deployed. The midterm elections are over. so they forgot they're there, along with President Trump's rafter-shaking rallies, they weren't even that, warning that an approaching migrant caravan of Central Americans amounts to a foreign invasion that warrants deploying up to 15,000, one-third of that, active-duty military troops to the border states of Texas, Arizona, and California. Jade Helm, everybody. But the 5,600 American troops who rushed to the brown, dry scrub along the southwest border are still going through the motions of an elaborate mission that appeared to be set in action by a commander-in-chief determined to get his supporters to the polls, and a Pentagon leadership unable to convince him of its perils. Instead of football with their families on this Veterans Day weekend, soldiers with the 19th Engineer Battalion, fresh from Fort Knox, Kentucky, one of Steve Mnuchin's favorite places, and presumably a place with nothing to do now that Donald Trump is undoubtedly emptying the fort of its gold. They were painstakingly webbing concertina wire on the banks of the Rio Grande, just beneath the McAllen Hidalgo Reynosa International Bridge. That was a rather stupid-looking exercise, didn't you think? Nearby, troops from Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State were making sure a sick call tent was properly set up next to their aid station. It's always good to be prepared with things like that. And a few miles away, Staff Sergeant Juan Mendoza was directing traffic as his engineer support company from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, unloaded military vehicles. Come Thanksgiving, they will most likely still be here. 2,000 miles away at the Pentagon, officials privately derided the deployment as an expensive waste of time and resources, exactly what you want to be doing with your military, and a morale killer to boot. Leading up to the midterm vote on Tuesday, the military announced that the border mission would be called Operation Faithful Patriot. Dun, da, da, da. But Defense Secretary Jim Mattis on Election Day told officials to drop the name, and the Pentagon sent out a terse news release a day later, saying the operation was now simply to be known as Border Support. The term Faithful Patriot, officials said, had political overtones. It sure did. That's why they picked it. A final cost estimate of the deployment has not been made available, but Defense Department budget officials fret that if the number of troops sent to the border does reach 15,000, the price tag could hit $200 million with no specific budget allocation from which to draw. The last time active duty troops were sent to the border was in the 1980s to help with counter-narcotics missions. Since then, Mr. Trump's predecessors have relied on the National Guard, which arrived with considerably less fanfare than the convoys of vehicles and tent cities that have sprung up in recent days. Got to scroll past some of the very nicely arrayed photography that's included here. Might as well credit our photographer on the piece, too, who's very prominently featured in this, Tamir Khalifa. So well done there, Tamir. The Defense Department's fiscal 2019 budget has already carved out funds for fighting in the Islamic State and in Iraq and Syria, continuing the endless war in Afghanistan, and preparing for a potential conflict with a foreign nation such as, let's say, China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran. They're in love in North Korea, but we might end up fighting them. There has been no money set aside to combat the men, women, and children who are bound for the American border, many of them fleeing violence or corruption, nearly all seeking better lives, and we can't have that. The troops are tasked with the same types of logistical support and even clerical jobs that National Guard soldiers sent to the border earlier this year are already doing. The military's morale issue is almost as worrisome. The deployment orders last until December 15th, meaning the troops will be on the border over Thanksgiving. They will have little to do beyond providing logistical support unless Mr. Trump declares martial law. Unless that might just happen. The troops will not be enforcing United States immigration law. That would run afoul of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, unless a special exception is made. And I guess you could see that happen. When you give a soldier a real mission, you have less of a morale problem, even if it's Christmas or Thanksgiving, said Representative Anthony G. Brown, Democrat of Maryland and a former Army helicopter pilot who served in the Iraq War. But when you send a soldier on a dubious mission with no military value over Thanksgiving, doesn't help morale at all. The soldiers, by and large, shy away from talking about the political winds that sent them to the border. That's smart. But in the last furious days before the midterm election, photographs of a group of soldiers clad in full military kit and flak jackets were presented at Trump rallies and shown in the news media. Mr. Trump himself lauded the stringing up of beautiful barbed wire at a rally in Montana. There's no question about their being used for political purposes at this point, if you're showing them at political rallies. Still, there is political theater and there is real life. 2 days after the midterms on Thursday, a platoon of Army engineers in Hidalgo, Texas, were stretching bands of concertina wire on the American side of the Rio Grande, had ditched the body armor. Probably too hot, right? The decision to wear only their uniforms, canteens, gloves, and helmets was simple. It was too hot to wear the armored vests, and the soldiers knew they didn't need them. And some had already suffered heat exhaustion just days into their new mission. Yes, there will be injuries and very possibly some deaths among the soldiers stationed there, probably from accidents more than anything else. Certainly not from any combat, because there's no combat to be had there. The fact that they were wearing flak jackets was purely for the photographers. So you need to be able to see that these are definitely soldiers, and they look like super awesome super soldiers from the video games, not like a bunch of people just milling about in olive drab or camouflage. It's supposed to be obvious from far away from the stage on the Jumbotron that these are soldiers. Roughly 15 miles away, some 500 troops, a medley of medical units, military police officers, and engineers, were settled into a routine at Base Camp Donna. It was named after the adjoining Texas town, where Border Patrol agents believe is one of the most likely entry points into the United States for the migrant caravan, should it arrive. It's a big question mark. Wedged between a 4-lane highway and the Mexican-American border wall, or at least where that's supposed to be, the base is reminiscent of those found in Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. As it was at the bases in those early war zones, electricity at Base Camp Donna is scarce, except to power lights and communications gear. In the last several days, the soldiers installed a small shower tent. Men and women have set hours for bathing. Permitted shower length, 7 minutes. There is no mess hall, just the brown prepackaged MREs. Military police officers patrol the perimeter at night armed with handguns. The tents sleep 20 soldiers and have no electricity or air conditioning. Phone charging is relegated to a few generators that power the spotlights around the living area. Sounds like so much fun. Captain Lauren Blanton, who oversees logistics for the base, is caught between monitoring the influx of equipment and troops and ensuring that her facility is livable, with enough amenities so the troops living there can call home. I want to talk to my kid, too, she said. The Army is setting up another outpost in an abandoned furniture store in nearby Weslaco and is eyeing a spot in Brownsville, all in an effort to shore up the entry points with, so far, hundreds of miles of concertina wire. Unlike in Iraq and Afghanistan, however, the troops do not receive extra combat pay, nor is there hostile fire pay, since the troops will not be interacting with the migrants. Although they may end up, I guess, what if they finally do end up housing troops in the basements of abandoned Walmarts, just like they said they were going to do in Jade Helm? How about that? What an irony that would be. Mr. Mattis, the defense secretary, has long argued against politicizing the military, just hasn't done anything about it. For the entirety of his nearly 2 years at the Pentagon's helm, he has sought to shield the country's 1.2 million active duty troops from the political forces that have plagued other agencies. In August, on a trip to Brazil, Mr. Mattis warned of the dangers of a military that is viewed as supporting one candidate or another, putting troops at the border to protect against what Mr. Trump deemed a threat in his rallying cry for the midterms, has put Mr. Mattis's view about politicizing the military on a collision course with the president. That clash comes as Mr. Mattis's relationship with Mr. Trump has deteriorated sharply over the last year. Last month, the president accused Mr. Mattis of being a Democrat. Oh no, not that. Mr. Trump has also chafed at what he perceives as the Defense Department's slow walking of many of his proposals, from holding a military parade. Remember that one? Wasn't that supposed to happen this Veterans Day? and it didn't, right? So that's why he went to France to do that thing instead. I don't think we even put that together. We forgot all about that one. So slow walking his military parade, to banning transgender troops, to putting into place a space force, all the way. Officially, Pentagon leaders said their duty was to follow the orders of the commander-in-chief, not to tell him how he can deploy American troops. But let's see. It's not my role to make those assessments, the Army Secretary Mark T. Esper said in an interview on Wednesday. We all recognize that one of the many missions of the military is defense of the homeland and security of our borders. The border troops are just the latest example of the White House pushing a mission that the Pentagon has resisted. In late October, the Department of Homeland Security sent a memo to the Pentagon with a series of formal requests for support in handling immigrants at the southern border, including the caravan on its way from Central America, according to two senior administration officials. Among the requests issued at the White House's behest were that troops deployed to the border be armed, prepared for direct contact with the migrants, and ready to operate under rules for the use of force to be set by the Defense Department. When Defense Department officials replied the same day on Mr. Mattis's orders, they rejected those requests and referred the Department of Homeland Security to the White House. The officials said the Department of Defense viewed the requests as inappropriate and legally treacherous, potentially setting up soldiers for violent encounters with migrants. For Mr. Mattis, you only get to fall on your sword once, said Paul Eaton, a retired Major General and veteran of the Iraq War who is now a senior advisor to VoteVets.org, a progressive veterans advocacy group. You pick your fights, Mr. Eaton said. This was a case of, we will do this, but I will protect the U.S. military and ensure the rules of engagement are appropriate. Defense Department officials said the tasks by the troops at the border were the best compromise that Mr. Mattis could reach. The Pentagon agreed to other requests for help, including sending supplies, setting up tents, and providing transportation as needed. A wasteful deployment of overstretched soldiers and Marines would be made much worse if they used disproportional force to the threat they face, tweeted Martin Dempsey, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They won't. Back at the border, near the Hidalgo Bridge, two soldiers squeezed into the cab of an armored front-end loader, its engine idle. They had spent the morning jamming engineer stakes into the ground as pillars for the new fence. Now the soldiers were enjoying the truck's air conditioning, watching camera crews interviewing their colleagues, and spitting a steady stream of sunflower seeds out the open window. Hours later, and 15 miles away, rain was in the forecast. Oh no, don't let the president hear it. Rain in the forecast as night fell upon base Camp Donna. Some soldiers slowly began digging a trench outside their tents to keep water from pooling around their cots and their feet in the coming hours. Others shuffled to porta potties and foot-powered sinks to shave and brush their teeth. A new tranche of troops who arrived just hours earlier were unloading their bags, bringing them to their cots in a quiet march. So that's the scene down in the border area. Aboard 5,000 plus troops with nothing to do and no amenities and no prospect of getting home anytime soon and missing the holidays, all for a mission they know to be nonsense and which will likely only get them in trouble when the caravan does arrive and end up making the Army look probably not that good. Not good. All right, moving on from that subject, though we are bumping up against another break, we probably should turn our attention, well, we'll leave aside things that are happening in Florida for our opportunity to talk about them at some point with Armando. But let's see. We already knew this news that Dana Rohrabacher was losing his seat, but a lot of attention paid to that over the weekend, and perhaps we can dive into one or two of the stories there about one. Remember, this was the guy labeled as Putin's favorite congressman, the other person other than Donald Trump that even Kevin McCarthy ended up saying on tape he thought Putin paid. So it's an important look at this, and we ought to take a peek at that. Plus, we can return to the question of Nancy Pelosi, the leadership of the Democratic caucus, what's going to happen, what will happen, what won't happen, what's likely to happen, what's not likely to happen, how this stuff works. Could probably use a few minutes reminding ourselves of all those things in the face of widespread calls, informal calls among activists and others on Twitter and elsewhere for the replacement of Nancy Pelosi, but we're not sure who would be the candidate to do that. And it doesn't stop people from throwing out their names of their preferred candidates, but those people are not declaring for the seat. And that's a sort of a big problem when it comes to getting other people elected, not to mention, that we're speaking for an electorate that isn't us here. You know what we mean. If you don't, we'll clear it up after this break. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see where we left off. Yes, we were promising a discussion of the leadership races and what it really meant. Shall we launch straight into that or pick up a few of the other little stories along the way? Why don't we go right into that and we'll see what happens with our last segment here. We'll start this off with a piece from Politico, because Politico is terrible, and it always pays to start with something terrible when it comes to sparking better discussion, I guess. I don't know. We'll try that. Oh, and look, I've got the AMP version of this story, so we'll cross our fingers and hope we get it right here. You can't beat somebody with nobody. It begins, that's our headline here, Pelosi foes struggle to find a leader. And before we even launch into the story, I guess we can just talk briefly about what's happening here. There are some number of Democrats who've been elected to Congress successfully, who, when pressed during their campaign as to whether or not they would support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, should the Democrats in fact take control of the House, felt it prudent for whatever reason to say either no or I don't know, or we'll see what happens, as opposed to, yes, sure, I will. And I mean, and I don't know what's going to happen is a relatively prudent answer, but it has, the question arose really from reporters because Republicans thought it would give them leverage with Republican-leaning voters. They thought Nancy Pelosi was extraordinarily unpopular, and that pinning down Democrats to supporting her for Speaker would cost them votes. And the media played along largely with that one, even though they could just as easily have been asking, well, if Republicans were to retain control of the House, would you, Republican candidate in this district, support Jim Jordan for Speaker, because he was holding himself out as the successor to Paul Ryan, which I'm not even certain why he was offering to do that. But of course, he's embroiled in his own scandal, having ignored widespread reports of sexual abuse among the wrestlers he supervised as wrestling coach at Ohio State, right? Do I have it right? Was it Ohio State? I don't even remember the story anymore where it took place. I remember what happened, but not where it took place. Anyway, no one seemed interested in asking Republicans that for whatever reason, either because the conventional wisdom was that Democrats were going to take control of the House and that was therefore the relevant question, or because Republican pressure on reporters all over the country, working the refs, works. And it had convinced probably more liberal-leaning journalists that what they needed to do in order to offset their own guilt at being biased toward reality was that they would have to take that suggestion and only pester people about Nancy Pelosi and not about Jim Jordan. And, she's certainly closer to reality than he ever was. But what it's led to is what it did lead to was a flurry of Democratic candidates who felt either cornered by a loaded question, or some of whom genuinely did think we needed new leadership, or who were just open to the prospect of new leadership, and they just were finding ways of saying, look, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't want to look ahead. It would be ridiculous. If I were to give you a real answer, you would say, well, gee, aren't you putting the cart before the horse? You're measuring the drapes in your office already? And that would just about undo them in the closing days of an election. So there was really nothing else to say. But it led to a lot of speculation among those not running for office, but supporting those who were Democratic activists around the country, some of whom have their own reasons to want new leadership in Washington for whatever reason. Some reasons better than others, I guess. It led to a lot of speculation there and lots of people saying, well, they ought to do this, and why don't they just do that? And how about Barbara Lee for Speaker? And how about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Or how about this one or that one or the other one? And not waiting to find out whether those members were actually interested in running for those seats. In some cases, they probably were interested in having those seats handed to them. I'll take it if you're giving it to me. But the logistics of actually running for it were either beyond them, or they knew exactly what they were and approached the whole thing with great trepidation because it wasn't likely to work out and it would make them look like failures. But a lot of calls for that, a lot of casual calls, I'm sure they were very serious in doing so, but they very often, people on Twitter, don't necessarily know exactly what they're talking about, as is frequently the case with me. Hey, I don't know what I'm talking about, but that would be fun to say. Let's go have some fun and say that. It might amount to nothing more than that. It might be that people genuinely don't know. A lot of people really genuinely don't know how we end up with our Democratic leaders in the House. Though we've discussed it a number of times on this show, it still turns out that there are many, many people who don't listen to this show, and they really should, and then they would know better. Not only how we are generally able to predict who will win leadership positions, and not just us here on the show, but elsewhere. Our quick and dirty tool, as you know here, if you're a longtime listener, is you look at the amount of money that they have given out to other Democratic candidates seeking election to the House. That's just traditionally how leadership hopefuls express their interest in a race and how they gain support for their cause. You give out money, which candidates use to win election to the House, and then, because in a fit of gratitude, they answer your support for them with support for you. That's what happens. That's how it works. That's why the funds that are raised by these leadership hopefuls are stashed away in what they call leadership PACs. They are about the business of collecting excess campaign donations, very often from big donors to their own campaigns who have maxed out their contributions and are looking for ways to add even more money to the pile. And yes, that's big money in politics, and it's looking to buy influence, and it works. How does it get used? It is used to elect other Democrats to the House. And when you elect enough Democrats to the House, the leader to whom you have donated this money to their leadership PAC becomes the leader of the majority, and better things begin to happen for you thanks to your investment. But yes, the cold, hard calculation here is the more money you give out to other House hopefuls, the more of those people begin to translate into votes for the speakership, because at the heart of all of this, and some of the things that aren't really understood necessarily outside of, well, the circle of people who listen to the show and who are political junkies in their own right, elsewhere perhaps, is that the leadership of the Democratic caucus is elected by the members of the Democratic caucus. Those members are the members of Congress who successfully make it all the way to Congress. Once you're elected, ta-da, if you're a Democrat, you're a member of the Democratic caucus, and at some point they're going to ask you, who do you want to be speaker? Who do you want to be deputy whip? Who do you want to be majority leader? All of these are put to what we call a vote in this country. And people tend to forget that these are elections for whatever reason. I'm not really sure why they forget such things. So I saw, for instance, calls over the weekend for Nancy Pelosi to make sure that a leadership team is put in place. If you're going to remain as speaker, and it's beginning to look like that's the case, then you at least have to make sure to put a team in place that reflects the new reality, that reflects the newly elected members to the Congress and the promises they made and the sorts of leadership that they want to see in place. Luckily, there's already a mechanism for these members to put into place the leadership that they were hoping for, and the system is they all get together and vote. And if there are enough of them, they will put new people in place. The only question remaining is, will they cast those ballots for the change they said they wanted to see, or will they feel obligated, interested in any way by the fact that some of the people that the activists on Twitter and elsewhere are calling for them to vote against offered a lot of assistance in getting them to Congress? We will see. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Where they didn't, well, fine. Cast your vote however you like. But it will be a vote. And that's part of, I think, what really needed to be cleared up. I'm sure it was understood by the people who wrote it, because it was, after all, I think it was John Nichols in The Nation, and he knows what's going on. He knows how this stuff works. And I think maybe the headline ran away with it. It wasn't a bad headline or anything. It was just a matter of, I don't know how other people, David, don't know how other people are going to read this thing. And John likely had some idea of how they might read this. And look, you have to have some words in the headline. So look, let's just get this thing out here. And if I scroll back down, I'll probably find the article we're talking about here, because it wasn't that long ago. But I thought it was important to mention to people, both on Twitter and here on the show, that, the leadership team that you're looking for, like I said, again, is an elective team. And the same people who would vote to make Nancy Pelosi speaker would also be responsible for voting for a new leadership team. And if they didn't do it, then there must be a reason for that. It isn't, in other words, the job of Nancy Pelosi to appoint the rest of the leadership. That's not how it works. It's not Nancy Pelosi gets elected speaker and she decides then who will be majority leader and who's going to be the whip and who's going to be the chief deputy whip. Though there are positions that are appointed inside the leadership, and you shouldn't neglect them. And they would include both plum committee assignments and actual caucus positions. And sometimes you create new positions out of thin air just to try and make sure that the key players in this new group of members coming in feel included and well represented. You actually go out of your way to just create those things. That's smart politics. And I will say that the headline that was tweeted around, and now I can't find it all that easily, but the headline made it sound like, we're warning you, Nancy Pelosi, you better include some of these important new members in your leadership team. And you should. But it leaves out the fact that she has been very, very adept at doing that year after year after year, both in the majority and the minority. That's one of her skills. That's one of the things that has made her speaker and one of the things that has kept her speaker when the Democrats are in the majority and has kept her as minority leader when they aren't, is that she's been very adept at including new members and picking out the ones that are key to include in order to get buy-in among the base for the Democratic leadership. So prompting her to do it is a little disingenuous if it's offered up in the spirit of, with the idea in mind that this is something she fails to do with regularity. And I'm warning you, Pelosi, you better not fail this time, because that's not really reflective of reality. By the same token, we could say and should say, it is well known, probably by John Nichols and others making demands like this, that one, she's pretty good at it, and two, it will happen, and so three, making the demand of it in front of people who might not necessarily know that it's likely to happen anyway, makes it look like you have made an important demand and won it. And that is a victory that Nancy Pelosi is very, very willing to grant you. That is part of the game. Part of the big dance here is that new incoming members will make this demand, and it is perfectly valid for them to make it, especially since they know it's likely to work out. And everybody looks good here. Nancy Pelosi will, look gracious to those who choose to view her as gracious, will look savvy but cynical, perhaps, to those who choose to wish to view her that way. And each of the newly included members will be able to go home and say they fought and won for this thing, and she's perfectly happy to let them have that story. It's good for everyone if that story circulates. So that's really kind of an interesting part of all this, and I'm not necessarily surprised that this one will play out this way. It's part of an ongoing charade, I guess, of sorts, that gets played every time, and it seems to work. So I would get out of the way of it. Let's look at what the Politico article has to say with all of that in mind. The House Democratic rebels trying to keep Nancy Pelosi from becoming Speaker have a big problem. They can't seem to find someone to run against her. And I guess also at the outset we ought to say here, the House Democratic rebels trying to keep Nancy Pelosi from becoming Speaker, we need to differentiate between, well, one, people who are genuinely, if there are any, House Democratic rebels, and the two very different kinds of members of Congress among Democrats who might actually be even somewhat interested in preventing Nancy Pelosi from becoming Speaker. There would be two kinds. And if you were cheering because, I don't know, let's say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has not expressed any visceral hatred of Nancy Pelosi, I don't think. But if you were cheering the notion that perhaps some super progressive new Democratic members of Congress might say we need a new, younger generation with more progressive ideas than Nancy Pelosi can bring to the table, whatever. You might be cheering at the notion of, House Democratic rebels trying to keep Nancy Pelosi from becoming Speaker. Be aware that there is another faction of Democrats out there who are doing it from the far more conservative wing of the party, who are, you would likely identify as very corporate conservative Democrats, who likewise would like to replace Nancy Pelosi because they feel she's far too liberal for their tastes. And in order to make this sort of thing work, it would likely require, interestingly enough, for members who are arriving and saying, listen, I promised my constituents from a very, very progressive standpoint that I was going to not support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. Well, there's some question as to A, what that means, and B, how to get it done. And teaming up with conservative Democrats to replace Nancy Pelosi with an even more conservative Democrat isn't going to serve the interests of the people you promised your opposition to Pelosi to. is it? So you're going to have to be careful about how that vote gets cast. And look, you made it to Congress. You're smart. You understand that there are people who are more conservative than you and more liberal than you, if that's possible. Maybe you're the most liberal member. Then you know everybody's more conservative, and it'll be easy for you to figure out. But yeah, this is an election like any other. It's just like a primary, and you know how those work. So there's some question about what it means to deliver on the promise to not support Nancy Pelosi, too. Does that mean on the floor of the House of Representatives, you're going to stand up and vote for some other person other than Nancy Pelosi? Could be. It does happen. And we get confused about how frequently it happens. But it does happen. In the last couple Januaries of a brand new Congress, we do see a couple of Democrats. It's gone back a couple of years now. It's 10, 20 years that Democrats have been standing up in small numbers and calling out somebody else's name. Nancy Pelosi, though, even the people that don't prefer her for Speaker know very well she's a great vote counter. And part of the graciousness, whether it's an act or not, that goes along with her successful execution of the speakership role is she knows that she knows what number of votes she's got to have, and therefore how many Democrats can be allowed to stand up and call out somebody else's name before something embarrassing happens. So what would that embarrassing thing be? That would be not getting an outright majority of votes for the speakership, 218, a majority of the House. Now, the Constitution, or the constitutional system, I guess we should say, makes room for the possibility of only winning a plurality of votes. Generally speaking, the answer in that situation is a second round of balloting, which is not a big deal. And a few people have thrown out the possibility that maybe the deal gets struck that, look, people need to be seen voting in opposition to Pelosi on the House floor where everybody can see it in order to be deemed to have fulfilled their campaign pledge. But that perhaps what they can do is cast those ballots for someone else the first time. Nancy Pelosi and whoever the Republican nominee is get the most votes, but there isn't a clear majority. Everybody anticipates moving to a second ballot, and on the second ballot, people say, all right, well, I gave it my best shot. Now, we're just going to keep doing this over and over again until 218 people vote for one candidate. I've done my job. I wanted a different speaker. I can't get it done. I'm going to vote for the next best alternative. And right now, that's Nancy Pelosi. Second ballot, Nancy Pelosi wins and is Speaker of the House, and everybody's happy, right? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. When was the last time there was a second ballot for the speakership, you might ask? Now, you remember that every year we hear somebody else's name called out, but that doesn't result in a second ballot. This is a different thing. 217 votes for Nancy Pelosi, and we go to a second ballot. When was the last time that happened? 1923, it turns out. It's almost 100 years since there's been a second ballot for Speaker of the House. So the potential is out there for, oh my God, Dems in disarray, right off the bat as the first story of the new Congress with the Democrats in charge of the House. They don't even know. They're not in charge of the House. They're not in charge of anything. They can't elect their own speaker. Okay, fine. Look, at the second ballot, it took 15 minutes and they got it. It's done. There's no Dems in disarray. Almost 100 years since blah, blah, blah. Apparently, I looked it up. 14 times there's been multiple ballots for the speakership. 13 of them were from before the Civil War. The 14th was in 1923. It doesn't look good. Is it survivable? Yeah, sure. By the way, I think there's actually a historical example out there, too, of one. I don't know how they pulled it off exactly, but there was at least one instance in which the House simply said, you know what, to hell with this. A plurality will do fine. And the new speaker is the person who gets the most votes, period. And that's that. And I don't know how they made that work, but I do believe I recall reading that in the histories. Anyway, The other way to make this all work out, when I said I don't know what it means to say I'm going to oppose Nancy Pelosi, another way to make it work out is to say, well, I voted for someone else in the closed caucus procedures. When the Democratic caucus meets, one of the things they'll do is, all right, well, who will be our nominee for speaker? It works kind of, just it's an analog to a primary election. Who will be our nominee for speaker? And you vote for all sorts of people, but the person who gets the most votes there, and I don't know whether there's caucus rules about needing a majority of the caucus or not, or whether a plurality gets you to the nomination, but almost no one stands in any position at this point, I think, to offer a serious challenge, even on the plurality rules, to Nancy Pelosi. So she would be nominated, though you could vote for anyone you want. Barbara Lee, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I don't know, Donald Trump. If you really felt like it, you could do anything you want. And then you recognize, all right, fair and square, I lost in the primary, and now we have a nominee, and I have a responsibility to the party who I choose to caucus with and the party banner under which I ran to vote for the party's nominee when the general election analog, the vote on the House floor, comes for the speakership. Remember, every single one of the Democrats there who ran in a primary made the same demand of Democrats who supported the other candidates in that primary. And it looks for all intents and purposes, now that they're elected to Congress and there's been this blue wave, it looks like it worked. They demanded the loyalty of the local Democrats, stand behind the Democratic Party, vote for your nominee, even if you were a bitter partisan in the primary. It's for the good of the country. And now they're saying, I guess, some people are hinting anyway, that they might have a problem performing the same duty in their very first vote on the House floor. And I think that would be, if not tragic, because we could survive a second ballot, and certainly misguided. I would be annoyed with any Democrat who made the demand of me that I fall in line when the chips are down, who would not fall in line when the chips were down. You could argue about whether or not the chips are down, but yeah, for me, I think they are. I think it's a problem if we hesitate in moving forward and showing that we can govern. Remember, now it's all going to be about that. We got to show that we can govern, even though we can't, because we only have one house, have one branch. Anyway, I guess what this means is we've neared the end of the show, and I've ad-libbed the thing and not read you the Politico story, which is probably a good thing, all things considered. But just by way of setting the table for further discussion this week, and maybe when justice takes over, let's read a little bit more of what Politico had to say. They couldn't seem to find anyone to run against Nancy Pelosi. The naysayers claim they have the 15 or 20 votes that it would take to block Pelosi on the House floor. They're talking about really doing it on the House floor. But so far, no one's stepped up as an alternative. No one wants to put their head on that chopping block. Who is it that caused this disarray? Raise your hand. No one wants to raise their hand. So it's unclear who might step up, if anyone, on this. Also unknown is whether that person would have a prayer against the experienced Pelosi, as flawed as her detractors say she is. Pelosi is acting like the next speaker already, and gee whiz, she's been speaker. She knows how to do it. And any effort to replace her faces immense obstacles without a viable alternative, said Democratic lawmakers and aides. In politics, nobody is perfect, including Nancy Pelosi, but the basic rules, you can't beat somebody with nobody, said Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland, who backs the California Democrat. And that's the problem with Nancy's skeptics. Another Democratic lawmaker who asked not to be named argued Pelosi has all the skills we need. No one else really has that package. Pelosi's critics believe that a challenger will eventually emerge. In 2016, Tim Ryan of Ohio waited almost 2 weeks after the Republicans crushed House Democrats to declare his bid against her. The question surrounding Pelosi's future is the only cloud over what was a hugely successful election for House Democrats, and I think it's exaggeration to even call it a cloud. On the one hand, there's a cast of incoming Democratic freshmen who ran on change, in some cases starting with Pelosi. On the other, There is no potential replacement with anything approaching the seasoning or legislative savvy the 78-year-old Californian possesses, making it hard to see how she won't be Speaker again. Leaders of the anti-Pelosi faction, and there are many of them actually, I would add, acknowledge that some lawmakers are nervous about taking on Pelosi, who's presided over the caucus for 16 years. That's why they've focused on growing their numbers. The first order of business, they say, is to demonstrate that Pelosi doesn't have the 218 votes needed to be Speaker, and after that, they figure a challenger will emerge. But I think they're doing it backwards. They're starting out by saying, I will stab the party in the front, stab you right in the face, in order to show you how disarrayed we are, and then we'll sort it out after that. And I don't think that that's going to be a very helpful way forward, particularly with all the challenges we face with this idiot president that we have. But we can talk more about it, and we will talk more about it, I'm sure, in the days upcoming. In the meantime, time to turn things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Let's see what we can get in by way of preview of his stories. It wasn't just French President Emmanuel Macron who rebuked Trump's nationalism in the rain during the Armistice Day 100-year commemorations in Paris. Also, Ted Cruz hired a data firm banned by Facebook and under investigation by the EU for his campaign.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, he's also got more on the Jim Acosta Kellyanne Conway story and her insistence that the doctored video isn't doctored. Trump properties made millions off the midterms election. And let's see, Matt Whitaker has to step aside, say Democrats, from the Russian investigation. We'll see whether he does it or not. He may be subpoenaed.